Hi, I'm Susan, also known as Professor of Words, and in honor of my class that I'm teaching for Ritualcravt School, not this weekend but next weekend, on Guillermo del Toro's films The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth, I would like to give a little free introduction to him today. So I'm making this recording, and hopefully, whether you can make the class or not, you'll find this interesting if you like his work. So a lot of this information comes from his book, Guillermo del Toro, Cabinet of Curiosities, My Notebooks, Collections, and Other Obsessions. And some of it comes from some other sources that I have looked at as well. So what's interesting to me is that when he was young, he was thin, pale, blue-eyed, and what he called a strange kid. Many times he was called a wimp, bullied. A formative experience, though, was that his father, who was a self-made man, won the lottery when Del Toro was 4 years old. His father then bought a library of books. Like, how cool is that, right? A library of books, including a series of classic literature texts for children, medical encyclopedias, and art books. And so essentially, Del Toro, as a kid, kind of became a hypochondriac. He was immersed in art history as well, but he got really into these medical books, right? His father had believed that, a person of class and status, etc., a person who had made it, would have a library, and that's why he bought this collection. But it was really a formative experience for him. So you can imagine if you take like the medical textbooks and art history, put them together, and you have like the backbone of Del Toro films. He also read comic books, especially horror comics. The first book he bought was at age 7. It was called Best Horror Stories, edited by Forrest J. Ackerman. And from then till his 20s, he aimed to read a book every 1 to 2 days. And he also started drawing with colored pencils. Long ago, when it used to be Twitter, I had an account on there, and I followed him. And it was really cool because, I'm sure he still does it. He would very frequently recommend books and artwork and music and all kinds of things. And there are books that I own that I wouldn't have even known about, and it was simply because he gave a shout out to it and described it, and then I went looking for it. So he really had like 3 early drawing obsessions. The Creature from the Black Lagoon, The Shape of Water, right? Frankenstein's monster, and I think I just saw the other day that they're filming Frankenstein. He's finally getting to do it. Like, he's been wanting to do it for years, and he's finally getting to do it. And Lon Chaney's Phantom of the Opera. He and his brother sculpted figures from clay, filled them with ketchup, and threw them from the roof. So his way of referring to himself was that I was artistic, but morbid. So I can just imagine the scene. It just kind of cracks me up to imagine him doing that. He really was somebody who was like, go and take risks, stand out. He once gave a talk at a film school in Hollywood where he was saying things like, go have a life, live, get into a bar fight, lose all your money, make all your money back, jump into a train. Just like this string of things he was telling people to do that reflected the fact that as a kid, he both observed, but he also lived, okay? He said that he and his brother would break into abandoned houses. They walked through the city's sewer system, etc. And walking through the sewer system, from what I understand, a lot of that was the inspiration for Blade 2, when he made Blade 2. A lot of that film takes place in the sewer system. So you can see that as an adult, he made films that show exactly these kinds of things, like the risk-taking and the horror and morbidity, but also this really artistic lens. He started making short films at 8, which kind of boggles my mind. By age 20, he was working under the filmmaker Jaime Humberto Hermosillo, who gave him the advice, if a road is not presented, you build one. And he says that he followed through with that with a lot of the films he's made. Fear runs through a lot of his films. That's a common theme. They may be called dark fantasy or fear-tinged fantasy. Unlike other writers and directors who present ways to cut ourselves off from fears, his films are really about confronting fear and facing fear with real life. He doesn't feel that fantasy helps us escape, but helps us to decipher reality. What are his own fears? Spiritual and physical blindness, he says, are two of his greatest fears, as well as success. He talked about how when he won, at different times that he's won awards for films, he notes that that kind of makes him almost complacent. And then he loses his edge. So he said it's actually kind of good sometimes when he fails. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing. You know, we think of failure as bad, but failure is really course correction. You know, it's just like, okay, that didn't work. Let's go this way. So he lives by that. He says, when you're young and unsuccessful, you don't have the money. And if you're not careful, when you're old and successful, you don't have the passion. So both extremes are tragedies to him. So much of his work is about a connection with his inner child. It is about what would make his childhood self happy, excited, intrigued, afraid, amped up, etc. I think that he aims to enable us to connect with our inner selves and to befriend the dark. A couple years back, I was guest editor for a humanities journal special topics issue. And what I ended up doing was quoting him in my prompt that went out with the call for papers. And it was my topic of the special topics journal was confronting the real in fairy tales. And it was about that whole movement of knowing that there is something you're afraid of and moving towards it anyway. And it was really in honor of some of the things that he has said. So an additional thing I want to mention is that I've read this essay called Ode to a Master by James Cameron, filmmaker and close friend of Del Toro's. So he notes that Del Toro's notebooks, and he has all these notebooks, like there's several, and he usually uses one for one film. Sometimes ideas get in there related to a film, and then he ends up using it in another film, but for the most part he kind of does one notebook per film. And from what I understand, I think they're willed to his daughter when he passes. But they're really like beautiful works of art in and of themselves. And Cameron says that he likens Del Toro's notebooks to the codices of Da Vinci. His work cannot be compared to others. The notebooks are an integral part of his planning, his ritual, his imagery, his themes, and the meaning of his films. And the notebooks, you can find some pictures online, I'm sure, of what the notebooks look like. Some pages that have been put out there into the public so you can see. He writes in Spanish quite a bit, but also in English. And they're filled with drawings, concept art. And that's how he works out the concepts of what a character will look like. And many times a character will go through several iterations. Like I'm thinking of the Pale Man in Pan's Labyrinth. There are several images of what he was calling the Pale Man. And it's only, it's like you have to go through and you see the progression till he gets to the final one. And he's like, yes, that's it. That's what I want. So it's interesting to see the thought process, to see the symbolism and the meaning behind everything. And you can't see the whole notebook, but you can see like especially in this book, the Cabinet of Curiosities book, there are a lot of pages that are reproduced that you can look at. Cameron says of Del Toro, that he writes stories and directs films that deal with our darkest places. He faces the darkness, taking what we fear, avoid, or suppress, and he uses that world as his canvas. He says, quote, he is the Santa Claus of the subconscious, the court jester of the id. He is our guide through the labyrinth of our worst nightmares, end quote. He helps us confront mortality, focusing on the beauty and horror of life. He's inspired a great deal by fairy tales, and there's a famous Tolkien quote referring to the fairy tale The Juniper Tree, where he refers to the beginning section of that fairy tale as having beauty and horror. I hear a lot of people quote beauty and horror like they made it up, like the phrase, but it's attributed to Tolkien initially. I mean, I'm not saying like nobody else in history maybe said it before Tolkien, I don't know, but that's where I'm familiar with where the first place it appears. And I've heard Philip Pullman use the phrase like, oh, I love the beauty and horror in whatever. So I think it's interesting that Cameron defaults to that phrase, but it really fits, you know. It's like you can have a story that is like Pan's Labyrinth, for instance, that has really sad, terrible, awful things happen, unjustifiable things, you know, and yet there's so much beauty in that tale, you know. It's just, it gets me every time. The first time I ever saw it, I was in a theater with the person who went with me, and I think there were like 6 or 7 people other than us in the theater. It was a little like indie theater, and just so few people. And when the film ended, nobody left because everybody was crying, like audibly crying, sobbing, okay, which is understandable. I think I was literally on the edge of my seat for that film because it's so intense. So, you know, you can see how he's so good at doing the dark fairy tale, which Pan's Labyrinth is. And in a way, The Devil's Backbone is, except The Devil's Backbone is probably more like ghost horror story, paranormal story, than it is a fairy tale. But there are fairy tale elements to it. Cameron continues that Del Toro's notebooks are maps to his mind, his art, and to the subconscious. And it is through these books and his desire to talk about his work that we come to know him and his works of art. And I love this quote that Cameron says about Del Toro. Quote, if he didn't exist, we'd have to invent him. But how do you invent the impossible? End quote. So that's my little introduction to Del Toro as a filmmaker. And if you're interested in learning more specific to 2 of his films, I'm going to be talking about them, not this weekend, but the next weekend. You can go to the link in my bio and purchase the class, and you'd be supporting both me as a teacher and Ritualcravt School, who is hosting. And it should be a great class. You know, I love this material. I love sharing the slides with people and talking about how you can interpret the film and how, in particular, these films, because they're related, there's so many interesting ways they work together. And there's even like shot-for-shot similarities that you don't really notice till you really look. And then you're like, oh my God, isn't that, he's doing it. He's doing a shot from the earlier film, and he's reconstructed it, but instead of a male protagonist, it's a female protagonist, you know? So there's really cool things to draw connections about with the 2 films. So I hope you enjoyed this little introduction to him, and DM me if you have any questions, and I hope to see you at the class. Bye-bye.